11 murders over the course of a year and a possible wrongful conviction. Did they get the right guy? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Skid Row stabber. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, of course, hello, my name is Mike. If you're new to my channel, I tell many true crime stories every single week here on YouTube, so please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing, give this video a like, yada yada yada, hit the bell, you know, all the stuff. If you want to see short form true crime stories, you can also follow me over on TikTok. I have 2 pages currently. You can get to those pages in the link tree in the description of this video below. The links to my TikTok will also pop up here at some point in the beginning and also at the end of the video. Also in the link tree below, you will find my merch store. Just sell t-shirts and hoodies and stuff like that. We do ship all over the entire world. So if you are interested, by all means, check it out. And then lastly, if there is a case you would like me to cover, just send me a really quick email. My email is also listed below. Send me the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened. Just a real quick, simple email. I'll add it to my list. The list is over 6,000 names. I pick my cases at random, so I cannot promise you when I'll get to your case, but I will get to it eventually. You can also see that list. It's public. It's also in the link tree below, and it's in, for the most part, alphabetical order. But let's get into today's case. Skid Row is a large area in Los Angeles, California. It's bordered by 3rd Street to the north, 7th Street to the south, Alameda Street to the east, and Main Street to the west. Skid Row has had a fairly long history in Los Angeles, and it is currently one of the largest populations of the homeless community. There are sometimes between 4,000 to 5,000 homeless people living in this part of Los Angeles. To a lot of people, it's considered like a seedy part of town where potential crime happens a lot. It is also considered an area for the people who actually like live there, not the homeless people, but it's still considered an area that is well below the poverty line. The average annual income for a resident in this area is about $12,000 as of about 2019. Skid Row, which, you know, skid is referring to, you know, on the skids, was officially kind of labeled Skid Row sometime in the mid-70s. It became known as an unofficial containment zone. And this is what that, I guess, meant was that this was like an approved area where homeless people and shelters and homeless services could be tolerated and were acceptable. In the 70s especially, there would be a lot of Vietnam veterans who would find their way to Skid Row because, as most of us know, a lot of those people unfortunately ended up just being abandoned and were kind of on their own. Between 1964, and this is before it was labeled Skid Row, but it was still the same, you know, considered the same type of area. But between 1964 and 1975, there was a serial killer known as the Skid Row Slasher. There were at least 11 known victims of the Skid Row Slasher who would eventually be identified as Vaughn Greenwood. I have not covered his case before, but I will at some point. He is on my list. Then the murders obviously stopped, but between 1978 and 1979, another string of murders would occur in Skid Row. This killer would become known as the Skid Row Stabber. It was October 23rd, 1978. A 50-year-old man named Jesse Martinez had been found stabbed to death in Skid Row. 5 days later, another person was found stabbed to death, 32-year-old Jose Cortez. Just 2 days after that, a 46-year-old man named Bruce Emmett Drake was found stabbed to death in Skid Row. Then on November 4th, a 65-year-old man named J.P. Henderson was found stabbed. 2 days after that, November 11th, Francisco Perez Rodriguez, a 57-year-old man, found stabbed to death. Just a day after that, 2 more bodies show up. 36-year-old Frank Floyd Reed and 49-year-old Augustine Luna. November 17th, a man named Melford Fletcher, a 35-year-old man who I guess was also nicknamed Jimmy White Buffalo. Well, he was found murdered. November 23rd, a 45-year-old man named Frank Garcia, found stabbed to death. He was found stabbed on a bench just outside of Los Angeles' City Hall. At this particular crime scene, police did collect a palm print that was found on the bench. When they didn't have a suspect at that point, so they didn't match it to anyone, but they did collect it. On December 14th, 1979, police in Los Angeles saw a man. His name was Bobby Joe Maxwell. Police saw him standing kind of, I guess, creepily over a drunk guy on the street in the Skid Row area. And so police searched him, and they found a knife on Bobby Joe Maxwell's person. He would end up pleading guilty to a misdemeanor for possession of a concealed weapon, and he got 60 days in jail for it. This knife, police would say, were somewhat consistent with the stab wounds found on the victims so far of the Skid Row stabber. They thought also was kind of strange was that during the 60 days or so that Bobby Joe Maxwell was in jail, there weren't any stabbings. He was released on January 18th, 1979, and then suddenly, 3 days later, another man is found stabbed to death in Skid Row, a 26-year-old man named Luis Alvarez. There was also another stabbing that I guess happened on November 9th, a man named David Martin Jones. When it was all said and done, there were 11 victims of this supposed so-called Skid Row stabber. Because police already had Bobby Joe Maxwell's knife in their evidence locker, and because no stabbings occurred when he was in jail, he was arrested. And he was charged with the murders. He was officially arrested on April 4th, 1979. What evidence did they actually have against Bobby Joe Maxwell? None. Well, except for one thing. When they arrested him, they took his palm print and his fingerprints. There was that palm print, like I said, found on the bench where one of the victims was stabbed to death. That palm print just so happened to be Bobby Joe Maxwell's. Bobby Joe Maxwell was someone who was in that Skid Row area all the time, and he was seen there all the time. The palm print wasn't in blood. It wasn't like over blood. It was just on the bench. And the fact that his palm print was found on that bench to police meant he was guilty of all of the murders. But to, I guess, anyone else, if you really look at it, it doesn't really prove anything. It proves that at one point he touched that bench or he sat on it and put his hand on it. That's all it really proves. But they already knew he's in the area all the time. Bobby Joe Maxwell is sitting in a jail cell for not just a couple of months awaiting trial. He sits there for 5 years before they finally actually go to trial. His trial wasn't until January of 1984. At that point, he was not charged with the stabbing death of the very first victim, Jesse Martinez. Prosecutors say they just did not have enough evidence. Just for him, really? Okay. So instead, he's on trial for 10 murders. What was the motive, according to police and prosecutors? Well, it's simple. Bobby Joe Maxwell was a devil worshiper, obviously. They said he was killing vagrants and derelicts in the area to provide souls for Satan, is literally what they said. Grown adults said that. Because of the amount of victims, the amount of crime scenes, the trial lasted to July. So it was from January to July. They could not, the prosecution, the only physical evidence they could even present to a jury was that palm print on a bench, on a public bench in an area where this man had been frequently. There was none of his blood or DNA. And this is in the 70s, so obviously DNA wasn't really a thing, but they didn't have any blood they would assume was from the killer. They didn't have any hair samples. They didn't have anything. They had not a single piece, other than the palm print, of physical forensic evidence to tie Bobby Joe Maxwell to these murders. The knife was a very common knife. It wasn't just Bobby Joe Maxwell who owned a knife like this. A lot of people did. And they couldn't even prove that that knife was the murder weapon. It just said it was consistent with the wounds from some of the victims. Some of them, not even all of them. Bobby Joe Maxwell was unemployed at the time, and he was living with a family member. He was not living anywhere in Skid Row. He wasn't living in a tent there, but he did admit that he had been to Skid Row all the time. And he even admitted sitting on that bench and touching that bench many times. And so what are they basing this off of exactly? Well, they had evidence like they confiscated a Bic lighter from his home where he was living, and he had a diary or a journal or something like that. As they're flipping through this diary, there is a phrase that he, I guess, wrote down that said, quote, "Satan, praise be unto you," end quote. And there it is, folks. He used the word Satan. He wrote the word Satan down on a piece of paper, so he must be the Skid Row stabber who's doing this to provide souls to the devil. Yep. They did provide witnesses to the murder of one of the victims, David Martin Jones. There were 3 friends who were witnesses to his murder. These men said he was stabbed by a black man with a Caribbean accent. This man approached the witnesses and said his name was Luther. One of the witnesses said that this man had a very unusual gait. The way he walked was, I guess, odd. And that's when the victims, I don't think they actually witnessed the physical stabbing, but they witnessed the guy, and then literally within like a minute or two, Mr. Jones is screaming like, "I just been stabbed, I just been stabbed." And these friends kind of approached the situation, and they asked him, who did it? And they said it was that guy, the guy who was just here. And then unfortunately, Mr. Jones would end up passing away. One of the witnesses said that when they heard Bobby Joe Maxwell's voice after he was arrested, he said, "That sounds a lot like the voice that I heard from that man." This particular witness, by the way, died before the trial. And so they only had, I guess, recorded testimony of him. In January of 1979, police say that they found graffiti written in a bathroom at Skid Row. And this was at a bus station. And there was a quote on the wall. And it said, quote, "My name is Luther. I kill winos to put them out of their misery." End quote. The jurors were told by the defense at the trial, Bobby Joe Maxwell was put into a police lineup, and he was instructed to say that his name was Luther. And the 2 witnesses who were still alive, when they saw the lineup and they heard all of these people say, "My name is Luther," the 2 witnesses who actually saw the guy just before their friend was stabbed to death, they said, none of those sound like him. None of these guys you just showed us sound like the guy. And one of them actually said, quote, "You've got everybody up there that doesn't even look like him." End quote. Meaning Bobby Joe Maxwell, who was in that lineup along with other men, the witnesses who saw the man who eventually stabbed their friend, said none of those look like him or sound like him. None of those men. And then one of these witnesses would also send a letter to the prosecutor's office before the trial happened and said, quote, "I sure hope you have the right guy, because if you do, he sure did change a lot in the last 6 months." End quote. So these witnesses who saw the guy who killed their friend, they're all saying, "It doesn't look like Bobby Joe Maxwell. Like, who the fuck is this guy? That's not the guy." The prosecution would put up an expert that said that there were shoe impressions found next to one of the victims, Frank Garcia's body. They were in mud. And so they were not exactly the greatest shoe impressions, but they said they were, this expert said they were consistent with a similar pair of shoes that Bobby Joe Maxwell wore. And they said that the stride and the gait of this person who left these impressions was similar to Bobby Joe Maxwell's. But then the defense put up an expert that said there is no way anybody could tell the gait this person had based on these crappy, muddy shoe impressions. Now, the Bic lighter they found in Maxwell's home, what they tried to claim was stolen off of Frank Garcia. Garcia's wife would testify that said, that lighter looks like a lighter that Frank had. One of Frank Garcia's children said, I mean, I don't recognize this particular one, all that much. These were Bic lighters. Bic lighters were super common. And so no one could really say for sure that was like the stolen Bic lighter. There were also blood samples and cigarette butts found next to the body of Martin Jones. Later down the road, when they did have the ability to test, at least, they can do blood typing with DNA, they would determine that the cigarette butts and the blood samples found next to Mr. Jones's body were not consistent with Bobby Joe Maxwell's. But the tour de force, the main thing they had, the prosecution, was because they really lacked on physical evidence, but they did have our favorite thing, a jailhouse informant. A man named Sidney Storch, a man who was a former police officer turned criminal / I guess, unhoused homeless person. He had a very long list of crimes. So Sidney Storch was in a jail cell with Bobby Joe Maxwell for roughly 3 weeks. He says that one day Bobby was reading a newspaper talking about the murders. And Storch says that Maxwell said, quote, "I made a mistake by not wearing gloves," end quote. And so Sidney Storch goes to the prosecutors and says, "Hey, listen, I got a whole bunch of crimes you guys are charging me with. If you give me just 3 years in prison, I will testify against Bobby Joe Maxwell." And that's what the prosecution did. They said, okay, boom, we got him. The defense for Bobby Joe Maxwell found out that Storch and Maxwell did not share a cell for 3 weeks. They, as a matter of fact, only shared a cell for about 3 or 4 nights. That's it. But he was the prosecution's star witness, and it was primarily because of him that really proved their case. On July 12th, 1984, the jury comes back. They had deliberated for about 3 days or so, and they found Bobby Joe Maxwell guilty of the murder of David Jones and Frank Garcia. The jury completely acquitted him on the murders of J.P. Henderson, Francisco Rodriguez, and Milford Fletcher. They were not able to come to a unanimous decision on the murders of Jose Cortez, Bruce Emmett Drake, Frank Lloyd Reed, Augustine Luna, and Luis Alvarez. And so for those victims, there was a mistrial called. The prosecution told the jury, "We want you to sentence him to death for what he did, for what we proved that he definitely did." Obviously, you didn't prove that really well because, first of all, they're saying that all 11 victims were killed by the same person. Well, they only were able to find him guilty of 2 of these murders. By the mid-1980s or the late 1980s, there was a scandal in Los Angeles County with regards to prosecutors using jailhouse snitches to secure convictions, which is a practice that was done a lot in the 80s and 90s and still pretty much used today. That in this particular case, Mr. Storch was looking for a deal. He was looking at a long prison sentence, but he got a reduced one, just 3 years, for the laundry list of crimes he committed, all for his testimony against Bobby Joe Maxwell. Well, Storch was a known pathological liar. He was not just used in Bobby Joe Maxwell's trial. No. He was used in many trials, especially people who were they were facing murder charges at trial. He would testify as a jailhouse snitch that all of these people just so happened to confess to him. Later down the road, Sidney Storch would actually admit that he just read a newspaper about the murders, and he just used that to tell police what he knew, or what he said Bobby Joe Maxwell confessed to. And he said he did that with the other ones too. He just read newspapers because they were readily available, and all he had to do was just convince police. And so the biggest piece of anything that the prosecution had was this guy. But even now, that's completely thrown to shit. In 1991, Bobby Joe Maxwell appeals his conviction, and unbelievably, the California Court of Appeals upholds his conviction. He was denied again in 1993. Then, he was continuing to fight between 1997 and 1999 or so. By the year 2000, he gets his case to the California Supreme Court. And this is insane to me, but the courts said, they acknowledged that Sidney Storch, who has now confessed to being basically providing false testimony in numerous cases, who has now admitted that he just reads the stories in the newspapers and says, oh, this is how I convince police that someone to confess to me. The Supreme Court in California said, well, in this case, he was telling the truth. What he said, Bobby Joe Maxwell said, that was the one time apparently he was telling the truth. He tries again in 2001 or 2002. He's once again denied. 2002, 2003 or so, they're trying once again, and they have evidence to show that the prosecution actually failed to provide to the defense team that Sidney Storch, who, as far as they knew, was given a 3-year sentence, well, there was actually a secret deal cut underneath that one that they did not tell the defense. That, as a matter of fact, they were going to secretly reduce Sidney Storch's 3-year conviction down to just 16 months for his testimony against Bobby Joe Maxwell. And when asked on the stand about what deals he had, he lied. He said, I was only given this 3-year deal. And he would later down the road say the prosecution said it was okay if he lied about that. In 2006, he's once again trying to appeal. And in this appeal, God, this guy has had the worst luck. This is in 2006. They said that, quote, while Storch may have lied about his deal with the prosecution and failed to disclose it, Maxwell still received a constitutionally fair trial, end quote. No, he did not. In 2010, once again, we're back at it. But this time, the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals reverses the previous ruling the judge gave that I just mentioned and ordered that a new trial should occur for Bobby Joe Maxwell. They said in their ruling that it's, quote, first, it is undisputed that Storch told numerous lies at Maxwell's trial. At a minimum, Storch lied about his motivation for coming forward, his prior record, the amount of money he had stolen, the level of education he attained, and the fact that he had previously worked out a 36-month prison term in exchange for his guilty plea before the 16-month deal he ultimately received in exchange for his cooperation and testimony at Maxwell's trial, end quote. Then they said, quote, here, Storch lied about Maxwell's confession in order to reduce his own jail time. Storch went on to testify for the prosecution and to lie in numerous other cases. He became one of Los Angeles County's most infamous jailhouse informants, and he operated at the height of the county's jailhouse informant scandal, end quote. And so the appeals court also ruled that the prosecution, because they failed to disclose the secondary private deal, and they knowingly allowed Storch to testify falsely and provide false testimony, that Bobby Joe Maxwell, 100%, he is getting a new trial. The prosecution was appealed that decision, but then the U.S. Supreme Court decided that we're not even going to listen to you. Bobby Joe Maxwell was waiting in his prison cell until 2013 or so. In 2013, prosecutors were given new indictments against Bobby Joe Maxwell for 3 of the murders that resulted in a mistrial back in the 1984. They said they were going to also retry him for Frank Garcia and the David Martin Jones murders. The David Martin Jones murders is the one where the witnesses were like, Bobby Joe Maxwell's not the guy. Doesn't look like him, doesn't sound like him. But apparently you guys think it is him. But the retrial would never happen. In December of 2017, Bobby Joe Maxwell suffered a severe heart attack, and he fell into a coma. By July 2018, the medical experts said that he will not live for another 6 months. He will die. But unfortunately, Bobby Joe Maxwell died in 2019. Unfortunately, he died before ever knowing he was actually exonerated, because the prosecution in 2018 decided to drop all the charges against Bobby Joe Maxwell for the murders of the Skid Row stabber. But because he was in a coma, he never knew that. His family got to know. His family got to know that there were going to be no more trials, that it was over. And so ultimately, in the end, Bobby Joe Maxwell technically got a life sentence in prison. He died essentially thinking he was probably going back to prison. Bobby Joe Maxwell's life ended in 1979. That's where it ended. Police never had any other suspects in the Skid Row stabbings, and at this point, they probably never will. I think in some degree, some of the people in the prosecutor's office or working for the police think that he still is the guy, It's just that they dropped charges because, well, they knew he was dying. But he was exonerated. This is an official exoneration. There was no evidence against him. There was nothing. They had testimony from witnesses who said he wasn't the guy. They had a jailhouse informant who literally was a pathological liar to get deals. He even admitted he made the shit up, like he was lying. He did so to get less time in jail. Nothing pointed to Bobby Joe Maxwell. That palm print on a bench, on a popular bench in an area that he frequented, okay, that's nothing. And that's it. This guy's life ended in 1979 because police were like, man, we just need to have someone. We gotta have someone for this, so let's just say it's him. I don't know if they're planning to retest any of the evidence or anything like that to see if they can get, find out whose DNA it was, like on the cigarette butts and the blood drops that were found. I want to say they're planning to test them, but I can't say that for sure because I don't know. But as of right now, Bobby Joe Maxwell is exonerated from being responsible for being the Skid Row stabber. And the Skid Row stabber got away. This happened in 1978, 1979. The guy could still definitely be alive, or girl, could still definitely be alive, or could very well be dead. And because they focus so heavily on one person only, whoever this may have been has had decades to hide themselves, hide any evidence, and get away. And even if one day they do test that DNA and say, oh, this is the person who did it, are they really gonna face actual justice? The odds are probably not. But you never know. They could still. So the 11 victims of the Skid Row stabber and Bobby Joe Maxwell, who in my opinion was the 12th victim in this, none of them got the justice that any of them have rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case. True crime, a rooney dooney dingleberry dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, please subscribe, give this video a like, follow me over on TikTok if you want to, check out the merch, go to my email, weird ways of saying things, Mike, and recommend a case to me? ? I don't know. What are you doing? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. What the was that? What was that? Like Hannibal Lecter. Oh, this is the end of the video. I'm supposed to say there's a word. There's a word for it. Utility fuck. That is definitely not it. Well, that was my one and only opportunity. Okay. I'm blind.